Hello, this is Jerry Holmes, and this presentation is called Social Development. In previous academic presentations, we looked at how a child develops first from the cognitive perspective, or how the mind develops, and then morally, how one develops a sense of right and wrong. Now, in this third presentation, we'll look at the child and how they develop socially, or in the context of their world, their home, and their culture. The goal of this presentation and the ones before are to inform the listener on what is normal or to be expected in child development, and thus encourage and equip you as a leader to train your parents more effectively. I doubt that any of us had any real understanding of the full magnitude of what God meant when he said, "It is not good that man be alone." Most would assume he was speaking only of adult companionship, procreation, and practical help and support, as implied in Eve being a helpmeet. Few sermons have focused, though, on the impact of this statement on children and their own needs for interaction and for help. But the impact of the people in our life has great effect on us, right from the time of our conception through our childhood and adolescent journey. Even before birth, the human child is building a social context of their life. They recognize sounds and their mother's and father's voices, and later they can respond to the emotional content on their parents' faces. Immediately after birth, the child's brain is able to recognize a human face. In fact, there is a consensus that very soon in their development, children become face experts. This face recognition bias means they're able to identify people who appear frequently in their environment and help them distinguish racial and facial features. In infancy, the developing brain can recognize and mirror the behaviors of their caregivers, starting with simple body gestures. So why is this significant? From a scientific perspective, we were built to grow in the context of human connections. This connection is more than just emotional. In fact, it's hardwired into our brains. Advances in neuroimaging have allowed researchers to investigate the neural underpinnings of the parent-child bond in parents and in their children. Simply put, what this means is our brains make room or pathways for our parents. Continued studies reveal that a child has neural patterns that are activated in the presence of their parent even on into adolescence. And these neurological connections change the way we respond to life. What is also interesting is that the parent's brain makes room for their children. Both mother's and father's brains undergo changes after the birth of a baby, changing to develop neural connections with their child. These connections mean we learn much from our parents' interactions with us, and we tend to pattern our lives based on these neural pathways. On the flip side, when children do not attach well to parents and lack these neural pathways, it affects the child in negative ways. For example, a low activation in adolescence when seeing pictures of their mother or in the presence of their mother correlated with symptoms of depression in youth. Not much had been said about the impact of relationships or socialization on children until the 1960s, when John Bowlby published a trilogy of books introducing the concept of attachment and its importance in child development. As a young man, Bowlby worked in a school for maladjusted children, where he observed that behavioral disturbances in children seemed to be related to family dysfunction. Later, he studied how children were affected by their separation from parents during times of war or due to illness. After becoming a psychologist, Bowlby investigated this further and wrote a number of articles in the 1940s and 50s incorporating the work of others in the field throughout Europe, including the work of John Piaget, Anna Freud, and a whole bunch of others. This resulted in much discussion and debate on the impact of key relationships on our human development. Prior to this, children were mostly marginalized or just ignored, assuming they would just grow up and become something. Basic needs were tended to, but children were considered watchers and not full participators in society until they were able to work and contribute economically to the family unit. This is still true in some third world countries or in poverty-ridden family units. But what was, and still may be lacking, was an understanding of what a child needs, a child's capabilities, and what happens in this interchange of children with their families and their environments, and how these influencers affect the child's behavior now and in their adult futures. Bowlby and others promoted a new field of research which has continued to grow. As feminism emerged, the discussion increased, addressing the questions, who will care for the children, and what kind of care or needs do they have? Bowlby's attachment theory focused on how children develop healthy bonds with adults or caregivers, which then, in turn, support them in making relationships through life. It focused on the significance that attentive caregivers have in developing a strong sense of security in the child, which results in confident and well-adjusted children. From Bowlby's work, we understand something called an internal working model. Bowlby's work suggests that the mother has probably the dominant influence of the two parents when the child is young, but when both parents are involved, this is ideal. He suggested that the earlier years are the most significant for creating strong attachment, but it was never okay to ridicule, reject, or ignore a child's attachment behavior, especially in highly stressful or traumatic situations, no matter what age. Are parents the only people who can create attachment with children and help influence internal working models? Many researchers say no. As we will see further in this paper, children are influenced by many different things, including family, community, members, and peers. But what is important to note is when a child has a solid and satisfactory foundation in early life and has as secondary figures those that provide, even from the background, support and stability, the child will handle hardship better all their life. So how is attachment demonstrated? How do we know if a child is well attached? Children and adults naturally modify their behaviors when they are attached to others. Interactions and communications with the attachment figures during the early years become patterns of attachment and communication that organize the child's perceptions, thoughts, feelings, and behaviors, especially in times of distress. The earliest indicators are, first of all, as we see on the slide, the need for the child to stay in proximity or in contact with the caregiver, and to reach out for that caregiver when adverse circumstances arise or when the child is distressed. We see this in adults who keep in touch with attachment figures through regular visits and telephone calls. Harry Harlow, 1958, the first to identify specific behaviors in animals, actually they were monkeys, who were attached to their children, said attachment results in better attention to feeding, temperature, physical support, physical contact, which seems very important to the child's sense of security, and protection from external threats or dangers. Mary Ainsworth, an associate of Bowlby, identified this behavior as sensitive responsiveness from the parent. So this is when the parent notices the signals from the baby, interpreting them correctly and responding appropriately and promptly. But if the parent is insensitive, the parent may act with unpleasant behavior, impatience, even with hostility. In childhood or adolescence, attachment is demonstrated by the parent who sees the child as separate from them and yet has needs of their own that are different than theirs. An insensitive parent may make the child feel bad when they have different needs, especially if the child is in distress. Sensitive responsiveness is similar to empathy, which is identification with another person's emotional state. So another characteristic of a child who is well attached is the child's ability to like themselves or have healthy self-worth. The model of himself that he builds is often reflective of the images his parents have of him, images that are communicated in how he's treated and what they say about him. These models involve how he relates to them and relates to others, how he expects them and others to treat him, and how relaxed he is at exploring his environment. Anxiety is a natural emotion experienced by everyone. However, when children have healthy attachments, they appear to have more anxiety in some situations and less anxiety in others. For example, healthy attached children will resist separation for long periods of time. Studies done in the 1950s of children who were hospitalized and restricted from parental contact were conclusive. When the separation was extensive, their anxiety gave way to a state of total freeze. The child gave up, stopped making demands. The caregiver assumed, the child had just settled in. However, when the parent reappeared, the child was angry, disruptive, distressed. The study concluded that long-term separation was hazardous and problematic to a healthily attached child, which was actually a good sign. When a child, or for that matter an adult, is led to believe they are nothing to their significant other, they will experience high levels of anxiety also because they feel their self is under threat. In a similar way, a healthily attached child will experience less anxiety socially and will confidently explore. If the child is confident that their attachment figures are reliable and consistently available, they're more likely to venture out into the world because they assume they'll be there when they get back, especially in times of distress. They carry themselves into the world with confidence. So, of course, we put all this in the context of cognitive development. In preschool years, when a child's mind is not yet developed, their parent is the primary caregiver and stays very close. That child is more sensitive to anxiety. But as the child matures, securely attached children are able to venture out farther and for longer periods of time. However, no matter what the age of the child, a child who is more secure if they know the parents are accessible and there is a secure base from which to explore. Children who have healthy attachments are generally more resilient. That is, they're better able to respond to hard or adverse circumstances. They are less likely to be as emotionally reactive, less likely to deny or sidestep problems, and they're more likely to problem solve effectively. So you can see how important it is that in these early years the child has a strong attachment. I'm not going into the specific ages or stages, as I have done in previous slides, for the sake of time, but I do want to generalize why socializing and interacting with others affects our development. So, what can we actually learn from socializing with others? Well, as we look at this slide, we see 5 things. We learn how to use words, how to express ourselves, and how to ask for what we need. Even shy children have to be encouraged to step up and use their voice. Number 2, we learn how to self-regulate. That is, manage our feelings and our reactions and choose appropriate behaviors. We call this an internal locus of control. There are a lot of things as we get together with other people that upset us, worry us, bother us. But how do we manage those emotions? This is learned in a social context. Number 3, we learn how to identify limits or rules and accept them and internalize them. Number 4, we learn how to concentrate, plan, and problem solve when difficult problems arise. And finally, number 5, we learn how to grasp another person's point of view, show some empathy, and to cooperate. Much of this last slide we can learn by socializing with our parents, with our siblings, and with our extended family. Some families would like to stop there and never go any farther by limiting the amount of influence that the community or the peers have. But is there something to be gained by socializing with peers and community? And the answer is yes. First of all, the child translates the working model that they gained in their home with their interactions and move it to a larger community context. Secondly, the child transitions from my space to our space. And some of those spaces that they're exposed to are quite different than their own home space. But there they learn how to share, how to negotiate, how to prioritize. And then number 3, the child learns how to choose friends and maintain friendships. If the child's social people are all chosen by the parent, then the child never gains the experience of looking and choosing and evaluating friendships. Number 4, the child gains experience in a less authoritarian structure. When a child is with their peers, there typically is no boss. Who's in charge? And what does that mean for me as an individual? How do we work? How do we get along? How do we decide things when there is no boss? Number 5, peers introduce discussion on a wider range of subjects, leading to more opportunities to internalize values. Many times the topics that children talk about are awkward. And when the children bring them home, the parents would prefer they didn't talk about them. But this is how we learn to apply our values, to apply moral principles, and how to sort through the many different ideas that exist in society. Number 5 or 6, the child understands that they're a sexual being, and they learn how to identify and relate to other sexes. Right from the beginning, we were aware of boys and girls. What do boys do that are different than what do girls do? How are we different? What do we like? What we don't like? How do we view each other? How do we get along? Finally, the peer group and the community provide the place where a child can practice independence in an informal and more egalitarian structure. By being away from the parent, they can become independent, but they can practice it in a controlled environment that allows them to make mistakes and allows them to come running back home to mommy. Are there key factors in a place, particularly in the home as the first place, that affect a child more than something else? And yes, I'm sure you understand the answer is yes. The quality of a parent's marriage is probably the most impactful thing in a child's life. Parental conflict creates a lot of insecurity in the child and a lot of anxiety. So when the child has anxiety, if they have healthy attachment, they seek an adult to soothe them, comfort them in times of distress. But when parents are fighting, they are not only unavailable, they are oblivious to the impact on the child. Also, every child wants a secure base from which to explore. But when there is conflict, they don't explore. They tend to shut down. They want to influence the conflict, but they have no power to do so or control in that situation. So the child learns to lack confidence in facing other kinds of situations. Sometimes they have a lot more anger, lashing out at those that cause the problem, And sometimes they have a lot more internal anger, blaming themselves when they get anxious and shutting down. On the flip side, when there is no absence in the home, parents get along, support one another. Fathers are present, mothers are present. The child feels much more secure. And minimally, I think all families fight some. When a parent realizes they have troubled their child and they process it, they talk about it, they provide comfort and support, and the child sees the parents make up and become happy again, there is less effect. A second factor that can really influence a child is whether they experience the loss of a parent. And that can come because of death, something unexpected, or it can come because of divorce. How much they are affected, of course, would depend on how old they were, how close they were to their parent, if there are other secondary supports available to support the child. But we do know that probably the long-term effect of loss is that when they become adults, they're more reactive to grief and loss. In the case of divorce, children sometimes lack a parental figure. Or what's even more deadly is they lose touch with their attachment figure. Many children feel like when mom and dad got divorced, one of the parents divorced me too. We have found that these children show more anxiety, feel less safe overall, worry more about their own parents' needs, and whether they're going to leave too. They may struggle with sensitivities to rejection, believing that they've contributed in some way to their parents leaving or the breaking of the attachment bond. A fourth thing that is probably another significant effect on today's kids socializing, and that is the effect of media. Media has an effect on children because of its influence. How is media shaping children? Well, no one really has a simple answer for that. And we can't conclusively say that all media is bad. We do know that the evidence shows it can have a direct negative effect on brain development and function if a child is exposed to a lot of media in their preschool years. Also, because of lower cognition, preschool children are less able to understand what they see, less able to separate fantasy from the reality, and most of their learning is about copying behaviors, so they have a natural tendency to incorporate the behaviors of the things they see. But as they mature, the negative or positive aspects change depending on a few different elements. First of all, what are they being exposed to? For how long? How much understanding do they have of what they're exposed to? And here's the kicker. Do parents interact with what they see, monitor it, or speak to it in any kind of way? Do they personally have a lot of media going on, and is it important to them? Again, we see a modeling effect happening in the home. So besides the home as a place of influence, there are many other places that form environments for children in which they gain certain skills and develop their sense of self. Place attachment, or a strong sense of bonding to a place, appears to have a good, strong psychological benefit, including a more positive feeling about one's quality of life and an ability to be relaxed. On the other hand, when a habitat is interrupted or changed, it may affect patterns of behavior, requiring the child to either adapt or withdraw. This is very common when a child experiences trauma or a family breaking up. But what can make a difference in the adaptivity of the child in these changing environments is the one-to-one relationship between them and familiar people who participate with them and guide them into adapting and accommodating new habits and skills. Children need structure. Manageable, self-sustained, manageable and sustained interchanges with people and objects in their immediate surroundings, and especially when challenged to change. Now, from God's perspective, does place matter? How much value does he put on place? Well, remember something. God took 5 days to prepare the environment for Adam and Eve before he placed them there. This was the most amazing place one could ever live. And it seemed to matter enough to God that he put a lot of time and attention into it. Secondly, we see Abraham was given a promise that he would own and settle in a land that flowed with milk and honey. There's a strong value on ownership or being from a certain place, or of knowing where one belongs. Third, it is responsible parenting to consider the environment and its influence on the children they are raising, and to the adjustments and challenges involved when the environments change or are disrupted. Sometimes people don't give enough thought to a move. They don't give enough thought to the environment around them when they buy a house or they live in a community. Even urban, suburban, or rural areas can have a different effect on a child. How involved will the child be in the community? Does the child identify with the unique features of that community? What about the income level? Will this be a problem for the child, comparing themselves to others? These questions are particularly relevant in the emerging mass of immigrants that are now coming into cities. Each environment has pros and cons and may or may not suit the individual or family. That's why it's worth thinking about. Now, what about the church? The church is a place, and it's a space. And that church can become a significant place and a significant space for a child to grow up in. M.D. Holden reported in his research that practicing religion, meaning church attendance, may increase social integration and support, and in turn improve child's happiness. The church is a place in which children can attach and in which they can be influenced. Another researcher suggested that the key is whether the child can be active or is passive. Do they participate? Can they volunteer? Many times the church can provide opportunities for children to apprentice or serve as part of their development. And as the child has a relationship to others of like-minded faith, it's kind of a bridge to and from their child-God context. Children need a framework, companions, collective worship. All of these things help them establish their faith. And so faith communities can provide additional connections to people who place value on the child, highlight their gifts, and make a place for them to individually express themselves. As I have done with other academic presentations, I want to bring us back to the child. We have to be careful not to assume that a problematic child had a problematic parent. God was a perfect parent to Adam and Eve and to the entire Jewish nation, and yet they all fell short of God's glorious ideal. There was a remnant, yes, that made good choices with better outcomes, but most did not. Although undeveloped, children are beings. They're choosing and they're interacting with numerous environmental influences. As parents, our motto must be, we do our best, but God does the rest. There are no absolutes, although, yes, the science does give us some predictors. But in this whole field of socialization, there are many different theories, but they fall into two categories. The first category is that children are deterministic, meaning the child is basically passive and becomes what society and family shapes them to be. The second one is that a child is a constructivist, meaning the child is an active agent and eager learner constructing their own world or place in society. Piaget's work in cognitive development affirms that from the first days of infancies, children will interpret, organize, and use information from the environment in order to construct ideas around their physical and social world. On the other hand, our understanding of genetics and personality lead us to conclude that children are already in some aspects made, and every child has similar needs and requirements, although subject to some deterministic factors. The problem with either model is how we define socialization. One writer, Corsaro, says when one hears the term, the idea of training and preparing the individual for the future keeps coming to mind. But he would rather see socialization as interpretive reproduction, because children are innovative and creative in the way they participate, yet are affected by societies and cultures in which there are members. We don't make a child succeed. We merely provide the best environment possible in which their choices are understood and appropriately experienced. From a scriptural point of view, every child is fearfully and wonderfully made with unique DNA and made in the image of God with innate, intuitive characteristics, which means they have deterministic factors. And there is reason why we are admonished to train a child and to discipline a child, and why there are instructions to children to honor their parents and obey them. Clearly, these things matter and affect outcomes. And yet we see in the scriptures that children choose or decide things, meaning they can exercise some will in their own growth and development. If they have to be admonished to listen and to treasure their parents' advice and to keep their own heart and to obey with all diligence, they must have a choice in it. Corsaro would suggest that we hold a balanced attitude. That is, to embrace the idea that children themselves are co-constructors of their childhood and society. They're not just useless, but useful, and should not be overly sentimentized or overprotected, but allowed to contribute as much as they can developmentally along the way to adulthood. So what hope is there? Can we have hope in this very changing social climate that's very, very different than what it was 50 years ago or 100 years ago? There are many, many more scriptures that we could look at. But what's important is Ephesians chapter 1, verse 5 says, God decided in advance to adopt us as family by bringing us to himself through Christ Jesus. Good roots will produce good fruit. When we look at the story of Daniel in the Bible and the other 3 Hebrew children who were taken captive by the Babylonians, some people say in early adolescence, we see that they did not meld into the culture, but they appeared to have some grounding in thinking about their faith that held them steady into adolescence. This is encouraging. However, we must remind ourselves that they came from a Jewish culture that was rooted in the memorization of the law, numerous feasts and celebrations that evoke talk of God, of God's involvement in their history, and of an overall worldview that they were a chosen people separate from the world around them. These were the moral foundations of the young men who were socialized in Judaism and yet taken captive. The other thing we have hope for, besides good roots produce good fruit, is that attachment wounds can be healed by other long-lasting attachment figures. After working with children who have common relationship difficulties and failures known as disorganized attachment, 2 researchers, Eglin and Strofe, focused on outcomes after abuse and neglect. They found that the course can be altered by transformational experiences and new development and pathways can be formed. But the major factors that enabled individuals to break the cycle of abuse were their relationship experiences, having an alternative, responsive caregiver in childhood, a long-term therapy relationship in childhood, or a current supportive relationship with a partner. In other words, what they found is the way to heal attachment responses is through another healthy attachment. This then presents our greatest challenge and mission. The church is the family of God, intended to take up the cause of the family. God's desire, from the scripture I read, was to adopt us into his family through Jesus Christ. It's never too late to begin to forge strong, enduring relationships with a child, provide support, and demonstrate care through engagement and interaction. Children can have an experience with God like Moses did, that can change the whole course of his life. If you look at the life of Moses, in some ways he was socialized in two different environments. He came into a culture and was raised primarily under ideologies and philosophies that were not godly. In some ways, he lost his identity and didn't know where he belonged. And yet, once he encountered God, Moses was able to lead the children of Israel into a healthy new place, new space, and a new relationship with God and others. We must never lose hope that God can and still does heal the brokenhearted. Are children better or worse off in our society today? Well, it's hard to say. We do know that children are experiencing more changes than in previous generations, at least in North America. And, as one writer said, diversity of experience brings with it a range of risks to which children are exposed. We know that children are spending significant amounts of time unsupervised by adults, growing up without siblings, and having sexual relationships much earlier. This could mean that they're growing up with less attachment figures and more time with peers generally. They are more likely to become independent consumers and do less work than their historical forebears. But I love Psalm 68, verse 6, which says, God places the lonely in families. God identifies his church as his family, and despite all of the disadvantages that children can be facing, they don't have to turn out bad. We can foster a church climate and support families in connecting and developing healthy relationships. We can be a family for the fatherless, the single mother, the orphan, and the disadvantaged. Psalm 27:10 says, even if my father and mother abandon me, the Lord will hold me close. Ephesians 1:5 says, God decided ahead of time, as I read already, to adopt us into his family. This is what God wanted to do. This is what gave God great pleasure, and it can be our pleasure too. Thank you for listening.